And David inquired at the Lord, saying, Shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, Pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. Welcome to the Monty Collier Report. I'm Monty Collier. You know, in Calvinism, we do not teach that the act of one's faith is what justifies before God. We do not teach this. We do not teach that the quality of one's faith is what justifies before God. Biblical Christianity teaches that it is only the object of our faith that justifies us before God. And the object of our faith is the gospel alone. The object of saving faith is only Jesus Christ and what he did for us. The object of our faith is not our works. It's nothing we do. It's not our effort. The object of our saving faith is not anything in us. So there's no navel gazing in Christianity when it comes to justification before God. Our saving faith, despite what many Lordship salvation heretics are running around teaching today, these Arminians who claim to be reformed, the object of our saving faith does not include our good works, as these Lordship salvation proponents teach. Those who teach that saving faith includes our good works and our love, such as John Piper, are teaching Roman Catholicism. That's the Roman Catholic view of saving faith. They are teaching justification by faith and works. John Calvin correctly writes the following, and I quote, If the power of justifying depended on the dignity or merit of faith, they, the Papists, might perhaps be listened to. But we do not teach that faith justifies on the ground of its having more worthiness or occupying a higher station of honor, but because it receives the righteousness which is freely offered in the gospel. Greatness or dignity has nothing to do with this, end quote. From Calvin's Commentaries, Volume 22, page 433. Let's take a look at Horatius Bonar. He writes the following, and I quote, The believed gospel saves, but it is the believed promise that assures us of this salvation. The work of Christ for us is the object of faith. The Spirit's work in us is that which produces this faith. It is out of the former, not out of the latter, that our peace and justification come. End quote. The Everlasting Righteousness, chapter 7, page 59. And all of this is exactly why the Westminster Confession of Faith states the following, and I quote, Those whom God effectually calleth, he also freely justifieth, not by infusing righteousness into them, but by pardoning their sins, and by accounting and accepting their persons as righteous, not for anything wrought in them, or done by them, but for Christ's sake alone, nor by imputing faith itself, the act of believing, or any other evangelical obedience to them, as their righteousness, but by imputing the obedience and satisfaction of Christ unto them, they receiving and resting on him and his righteousness by faith, which faith they have not of themselves, it is the gift of God. End quote. That is the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 11, article 1.
Brace yourselves, amigos. Gentlemen, we're history.
The Bible says, "Seek ye out of the book of the Lord, and read." Isaiah chapter 34, verse 16. The Bible teaches us how to act. It teaches us to be brave and courageous in the face of great danger. We that believe the gospel of Jesus Christ also trust in the promises annexed to it. We believe we are covered by the perfect imputed righteousness of Jesus Christ, and we believe God's absolute predestination works all things for our benefit. So we rely on God's governing and preserving providence throughout the course of our entire lives. The gospel and its promises motivate us to show our gratitude to God and help our fellow man by doing the right thing. And God's moral law teaches us right from wrong. It is a well-known historical fact that our founding fathers were devoted Bible readers. The overwhelming majority of the English-speaking people in North America at that time were Protestant, unlike the people living in the United States today. They, our founding fathers, were very Calvinistic. Even so, this segment's history lesson begins in 1 Samuel chapter 30. Listen carefully to this chapter. The Bible says, and I quote, "And it came to pass, when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, and smitten Ziklag, and burned it with fire, and had taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away, and went on their way. So David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captives. Then David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept, until they had no more power to weep. And David's two wives were taken captives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. And David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, I pray thee, bring me hither the ephod. And Abiathar brought thither the ephod to David. And David inquired at the Lord, saying, Shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, Pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. So David went, and the 600 men that were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those that were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 abode behind, which were so faint that they could not go over the brook Besor. And they found an Egyptian in the field, and brought him to David, and gave him bread, and he did eat, and they made him drink water. And they gave him a cake of figs, and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit came again to him, for he had eaten no bread, nor drunk any water, 3 days and 3 nights. And David said unto him, To whom belongest thou, and whence art thou? And he said, I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite, and my master left me, because 3 days agone I fell sick. We made an invasion upon the south of the Cherethites, and upon the coast which belongeth to Judah, and upon the south of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, Canst thou bring me down to this company? And he said, Swear to me by God that thou wilt neither kill me, nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will bring thee down to this company. And when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread abroad upon all the earth, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil that they had taken out of the land of the Philistines, and out of the land of Judah. And David smote them from the twilight even unto evening of the next day, and there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men, which rode upon camels, and fled. And David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives. And there was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters, neither spoil nor anything that they had taken to them. David recovered all. End quote. Now we turn to the 18th century, to North America, just days after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We focus our attention to the Kentucky frontier, to one of the United States founding fathers named Daniel Boone. Historian Robert Morgan writes the following, and I quote, On July 14, 1776, one of the legendary events in Boone's long career occurred. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon at Boonesboro. There were no church services at the settlement, but earlier that day someone had read from the scriptures to an assembled group, and when the customary Bible reading was over, Boone had laid down in his cabin to rest. Jemima Boone, who was 14, had stabbed her foot on a stub of cut cane and wanted to go out on the river in a dugout canoe to soothe her sore foot in the cool water. As a young girl, Jemima had enjoyed playing in the water so much she had been given the nickname Duck. Elizabeth and Frances Calloway, daughters of Richard Calloway, 16 and 14 years old, respectively agreed to accompany her. Nathan Reed had volunteered to paddle the canoe for them, but had backed out. It was a beautiful afternoon, and the girls glided out on the stream. Betsy and Fanny paddled by turns while Jemima hung her hurt foot in the water. They drifted several hundred yards downstream, floating and paddling carelessly. One of the Calloway girls suggested they stop on the north bank, near some cliffs, and gather flowers and young cane. But Jemima warned them they should stay away from the quote-unquote Indian shore, as it was against their father's orders to go on that shore at any time. The proposer observed that perhaps she was more afraid of the yellow boys than she was of disobeying her father. She was teasing, unaware that 5 Indians were indeed watching them from the brush on the north bank. The strong current pushed the canoe closer to that bank than they had intended to go. Suddenly, 5 Indians plunged out of the cane, and one waded into the water to grab the line attached to the front of the dugout. As he tried to drag the craft to shore, Fanny Calloway beat him over the head with the paddle until it broke. Betsy joined her in hitting the brave, and the other Indians waded in and threatened to overturn the canoe unless the girls got out. Once the girls were led ashore, the canoe was pushed back into the stream so they couldn't use it to escape. The 3 girls began screaming, hoping to be heard. At Boonesboro, a quarter of a mile upstream on the other side of the river, one of the Indians grabbed Betsy Calloway by the hair and indicated that he would scalp her if the girls did not shut up. The girls were pulled and pushed up the steep bank above the river, but at the top Jemima refused to go farther, pointing to her wounded foot and saying it was too painful to walk on. But the Indians waved their knives and tomahawks, threatening to kill her there if she didn't go on. The Indians produced moccasins for Jemima and for Fanny Calloway, who was also barefoot. Then they cut off the bottoms of the girls' dresses and petticoats so they could move faster through the brush. The girls wrapped the strips of cloth around their legs to protect them from briars and limbs. The Indians prodded them along, making their way on the tops of ridges where the ground cover was thinner. The lowlands along the streams were dense with cane and vines and thickets of cedar. The Indian party was made up of 3 Shawnees and 2 Cherokees. One of the Cherokees was a chief named Hanging Maw, whom Jemima had seen before, probably when the Boones were living on the Clinch. He spoke better English than the others, and Jemima told him who she was, hoping that he would remember that Boone had been friendly to him. He asked if the others were her sisters, and she answered that they were all children of Daniel Boone. Hanging Maw laughed and said, "We have done pretty well for old Boone this time." That afternoon the kidnappers and their prey traveled about 6 miles and camped near where Winchester, Kentucky is now. The girls were tied with buffalo tugs so they could not reach each other, each bound to a tree and also to a brave. All night the girls sat with their backs to the trees they were tied to, unable to sleep. Jemima happened to have a penknife in her pocket, but her hands were bound so tightly she couldn't reach it. The kidnapping was almost certainly not something planned by Hanging Maw and the other 4. It must have been a spur-of-the-moment temptation once they spotted the girls so far from Boonesboro. Taking prisoners or hostages lent prestige to the kidnapper, and capturing the daughters of Daniel Boone would bring even more honor. Kidnapping was understood by the Shawnees in a different way than by whites. The population depleted by disease and war, the villages needed additional members. Their birth rates were low. Women and children and even men could be adopted into the tribe, and after the correct rituals were performed and new names were given to them, the adopted became members of the nations. The kidnapping of children was not unlike the program the Nazis later practiced called Lebensborn, where children in the conquered countries were taken back to the fatherland to become future citizens. To Hanging Maw and the others, Jemima and her supposed sisters must have looked like candidates for adoption. At the very least, they could be held for ransom or sold to the British. The next morning, the Indians resumed the march toward Ohio. As they stumbled along, the girls broke twigs to guide those that might follow to rescue them. When the Indians noticed this, the captives explained they were so tired and weak they had to grab limbs to keep from falling. Some accounts claim Betsy Calloway began tearing pieces from her linen handkerchief and dropping them as clues behind her. The Indians caught her leaving signs and again threatened with their tomahawks, but the girls continued to break twigs and tear off leaves to mark the trail and blistered their hands with the effort. Betsy Calloway had shoes with wooden heels that made deep tracks in the ground by the streams and through the buffalo wallows. Noticing the tracks she made, the Indians knocked the heels off her shoes, but she still took care to make discernible tracks. Using the excuse of her sore foot, Jemima fell down again and again, delaying the progress of the party. When she fell down, she would scream out, hoping that anyone following would hear. She was sure Boone and the other men were on their way to rescue them. She made as much noise and trouble as she could, and the captors continued to threaten, but never actually struck her. That morning they came across an old pony grazing in a meadow, and the Indians caught it as a mount for the injured Jemima. In fact, all three of the girls took turns riding the pony, but they pretended they had never ridden before and kept falling off and irritating the pony to make it unruly. The annoyed pony bit Betsy Calloway on the arm. The horse was cross and would bite, Nathan later told Draper. The Indians laughed at the girls' clumsiness and then grew impatient. One of the Indians mounted the horse himself to demonstrate how to ride, but the lesson had little effect. The girls, who were actually experienced riders, continued to tumble off into the brush by the trail until the Indians turned the pony loose and made their captives walk. The Indians offered the girls buffalo tongue to eat, but the fare was tough and unsalted and pretty much inedible. The Indians sometimes referred to the prisoners as pretty squaws and showed they did not want to hurt them. Though they threatened the girls with tomahawks and knives, Hanging Maw and the others were surprisingly gentle with their captives. They were tolerant, even indulgent, by the standards of the wilderness. The girls were allowed to fix their hair and look for lice. Hanging Maw fondled Jemima's hair and took out the comb himself, admiring the length and brightness. In one version of the story, Hanging Maw asked Jemima to dress his hair and look for lice, and she agreed. Many years later, a niece told Jemima she would never have done such a thing herself. "Oh, yes, you would," said her aunt, "for the Indians were really kind to us." By the end of the second day, the Indians became talkative. They said they were on their way to the Shawnee towns of north of Ohio. They told the girls that Cherokees would attack the Watauga settlement, and a party of the Cherokees were on their way to attack the Kentucky settlements. They teased the Indian whom Fanny Calloway had beaten with the paddle. That night they camped a few miles south of the Licking River, and the girls were again tied up so tightly they couldn't sleep. Betsy Calloway, who was older, tried to cheer up the other two. The next morning the Indians seemed more confident that they had outrun any pursuers. After the party crossed Hingston Creek, the captors felt safe enough to shoot a buffalo and cut off part of the hump for lunch. They were all hungry, and the girls had nothing to eat for 2 days. They stopped in a little clearing in the woods to cook the tender hump and rest. When the girls' screams were heard at Boonesboro, Boone leapt from the bed where he had been napping and grabbed his rifle. He ran to the river without even thinking to put on his moccasins. People were dashing around, sounding the alarm and grabbing weapons for pursuit. The problem was the screams were coming from the other side of the river. The dugout was gone. Boone spotted the craft far downstream, but it was all out of reach. Samuel Henderson, who was engaged to Betsy Calloway, was shaving, but dropped his razor and ran for his rifle. Richard Calloway, father of the two girls, was flustered, but Boone was calm and organized. He told young John Gass to swim after the canoe, and when the dugout was brought back, Boone and 5 others crossed to the north bank, as Calloway, Nathaniel Hart, David Gass, Flanders Calloway, and others on horses dashed to a ford a mile down the river to cross. Boone directed some to look upriver for the trail, and some to look downriver until the tracks were found. Then he persuaded Richard Calloway and the party on horses to ride directly to the Blue Licks, where he knew the Indians would cross on their way to the Ohio, where they could intercept the kidnappers. Meanwhile, he and the others on foot could track the Indians. It is likely that Boone used this argument to get rid of the hot-tempered and rash Calloway, leaving himself and a few others, including John Floyd, to proceed with necessary stealth. But Calloway and his party riding to the Blue Licks also provided a kind of insurance. If all else failed, they might intercept the kidnappers there. Covering about 5 miles before dark, Boone and several others heard a barking dog. Following the noise, they came upon a group of men building a cabin deep in the forest. There they camped for the night. When the alarm had been given, the men of Boonesboro had been dressed in their Sunday best, which meant cloth pantaloons instead of the breech clouts and deerskin leggings. John Gass volunteered to return to Boonesboro during the night and get ammunition, supplies, and proper clothes for the pursuers. He found his way through the dark woods, reaching the settlement, and returned to the camp before dawn with provisions, clothes, and Boone's moccasins. Clearly he was already an experienced woodsman, and a brave one. As soon as there was light enough to follow the trail, Boone and the others set out. 3 of the cabin builders joined them. After they had found where the Indians camped the night before, they lost the trail in a canebrake. The Indians had split up there and taken unlikely detours, making it difficult to decide which trail to follow. Here Boone made a critical decision. Instead of following the trail, they would head in the direction they knew the party would take. That way, they could move faster and perhaps be less vulnerable to an ambush. They struck out in a straight course, moving as fast as they could, crossing and recrossing the trail. They saw the bits of cloth, broken twigs, and Betsy's tracks, signs the girls were still alive. When it got dark, they stopped to rest by a small stream and resumed the pursuit at daybreak. At Hingston Creek, they came on fresh tracks, and Boone knew they were closing in. Since the Indians were now moving with less caution, he also knew it was time to start tracking them directly. The Indians would follow the great warrior's path for a while, then slip off onto a buffalo trace and then another trace to confuse those pursuing. Boone followed every shift and feint. When they came upon the dead buffalo with its hump cut off, he told his companions the Indians would stop to cook their meal just ahead at the next stream. They saw a snake the Indians had killed and left flopping. They crossed a small stream that the Indians had waited for a few hundred yards to throw them off. Using great caution, Boone and the others spread out, knowing the Indians would be stopped just ahead. If the kidnappers were not taken by surprise and killed, they would tomahawk the captives to death at the first sign of the rescuers. Within 200 or 300 yards, they spotted the fire where the Indians were cooking the buffalo hump. One of the Indians was posted as a sentry, but he had laid down his rifle to light his pipe and pick up materials for mending his moccasins. Another Indian had laid down to rest, and one was getting wood while another was preparing the meat. Hanging Maw had gone to the branch for some fresh water. Boone and the others crawled through the underbrush to get closer. One in particular, Big Injun, called Big Jimmy, was spitting up meat on the side opposite to them. Fanny looked at him to see how he fixed his meat. She saw the blood burst out of his breast before she heard the gun. The girls were sitting on a log away from the fire when William Smith fired prematurely and missed. Then John Floyd fired, wounding the sentinel. At the crack of the guns, the girls jumped up. Jemima shouted, "That's Daddy!" and started toward the rescuers. Father yelled to them to throw themselves flat upon the ground in case the Indians might shoot back. The girls dropped to the ground, but in the excitement they stood again, and one rescuer, mistaking them in their ragged clothes for Indians, started to club Betsy, who wore a red bandana on her head. Boone grabbed his arm and shouted, "For God's sake, don't kill her, when we have traveled so far to save her." The man, when he saw what he had almost done, wept. In fact, there was a good deal of weeping when it was over. Nathan Reed, one of the rescuers, later said, "The exultation of the poor girls cannot be described. They embraced and thanked their rescuers. The girls were so overcome with gratitude, and the men with relief. The fleeing kidnappers were forgotten. After the girls came to themselves enough to speak, they told us there were only 5 Indians, and could all speak good English." John Floyd also described the place as covered with thick cane, and being so much elated on recovering the 3 poor little heartbroken girls, prevented our making any further search. The girls showed the effects of the 3-day ordeal. Their clothes were torn, their faces dirty and tear-stained, eyes swollen from lack of sleep, legs scratched by limbs and briars. Boone wrapped blankets around them and embraced them. "Thank Almighty Providence," Boone said, "for we have the girls safe. Let's all sit down by them now and take a hearty cry." Everyone in the party wept with relief and joy. After they had calmed down, Boone remembered that he had shot an Indian and pointed to the place. A rifle was found and drops of blood led into the woods. 2 bodies of Shawnees were discovered, one shot by Floyd and one possibly by Boone. 2 years later, Boone would learn that one of the Shawnees killed that day was the son of the man who would become Boone's captor and adoptive father. That was from Robert Morgan's book, Boone, a Biography, pages 202 to 210. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from this. I'll leave it to the audience to compare this history that we have here from Boone with the 1 Samuel chapter 30. I think it's fascinating to make comparisons like that. Anyhow, I want to go ahead and tell you of one lesson that you ought to learn from this, if you're a child especially, is that you might ought to listen to your parents. They often know what's best for you. And Jemima and those little girls that were with her, they weren't listening to their father, and sure enough, they got in trouble. In another history book that goes over the same account and does an outstanding job as well, John MacFaragher's book, Daniel Boone, The Life and Legend of an American Pioneer, he writes the following about this. He says, quote, "During her captivity, Jemima swore to herself that if she ever laid eyes on her father again, she would never disobey him or disregard his warnings. When it was over, so glad she was to be under his care and counsel, she would not let him leave her 1 minute." It is not unusual for people to make these innocent promises under such desperate circumstances, but the fact was, through the years that stretched ahead, Jemima was the child most frequently at her father's side. When he later was captured by the Shawnees and the rest of the family retreated to the safety of the settlements, it was Jemima who remained waiting for him at Boonesboro. And it was in Jemima's house that Boone lived for most of his last years. Her captivity and deliverance, her memory of that sudden moment when she saw him crawling through the woods to rescue, bonded her to him in a way unlike any of her other siblings. Jemima died in 1829, just 9 years after her father, after having spent so many years with him. It is perhaps not surprising that her attitudes so reflected his own. End quote. That was on page 140 of that book, Daniel Boone, The Life and Legend of an American Pioneer. Daniel Boone and his family is quite interesting. His brother Squire Boone was a primitive Baptist preacher. His daughter, Delinda, married James Craig, who was also a primitive Baptist preacher. This man actually preached Boone's funeral when he died. And Boone himself expressed that he had a preference for Presbyterianism. You can read about that on page 311 on Farragher's book, Daniel Boone, The Life and Legend of an American Pioneer. And on that same page, Farragher writes the following, and I quote, "Boone was never one of those hostile to religion. While he and Rebecca did not affiliate with a church, they had all of their children baptized. After Rebecca's death, facing his own mortality, he became an avid Bible reader." End quote. Again, it was on page 311. Here's a couple of quotes from Robert Morgan's book. On page 432 of his book, Boone, a Biography, he writes the following quote, "And of course we know Boone took the Bible as well as other books to read by the campfire on his hunting trips." End quote. On the next page, 433, he writes the following quote, Boone's, worship was in secret, and he placed his hopes in the Savior. His son Nathan told Draper, "In his latter years my father was a great student of the Bible. He was seldom seen reading any other book and fully believed in the great truths of Christianity." End quote. Page 433. Okay, now as I leave you, I just want you to guess which founding father inspired James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans. God bless.